Our next speaker, please join me on stage. I'm happy to say that Dr. Tamarinde Haven is both my former and future colleague here in Amsterdam. She has a background in psychology, philosophy, and epidemiology. She's currently a postdoc in Berlin at the QUEST Center for Responsible Research. Her interests include the importance of the research climate in fostering or undermining research integrity, responsible supervision, which is the topic of today, pre-registration for qualitative research, responsible assessment, and open science. As part of her PhD project, she actually helped to develop a training program for PhD supervisors entitled Supervision that has now been used at the Amsterdam University Medical Centers as well as the University of Amsterdam. Today, she's going to talk to us about good supervision and mentoring, a key part of responsible research cultures. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan. I want to first start out by saying that even though you see only me on the stage, this is not only my work. And on this slide, you see my fabulous research fellow, Nicole Hildebrand, my student assistant, Susan Awoniela, who both have been super pivotal in actually collecting the data and helping me analyze it. To the right is Martin Holst, who supported me during the pilot study, and all the way to the right is our research fairy called Benjamin Carlisle, who has been absolutely crucial in all of the data science bits and pieces you'll be hearing about today. But I am very honored to be standing here, and thanks also, Gowrie, for your excellent talk, because I do really think that supervisors have an important role to play in empowering their PhD candidates to conduct their work with integrity. So I want to focus a little bit on how I see supervision and research integrity coming together, and also how I understand the concept of responsible supervision. I'll say a little bit about the study that we've recently finished, mainly focusing on some of the prevalence and correlations we found, but also a few of our logistic models. And then I hope to give enough space and time for discussion where we can hopefully together also brainstorm about the role of early career researchers in driving research integrity. So often when we talk about research integrity and supervision, we seem to have two ways in mind. In the happy marriage, so to say, it is supposed that good supervisors socialize their PhD candidates into responsible research practices. This is what we see echoed back in codes of conduct as well. So the European Code of Conduct, and I quote, says that supervisors mentor their team members and offer specific guidance and training to properly develop, design, and structure their research activity and to foster a culture of research integrity. And we're not, of course, the only authors who think that. You see a few more on the slide here. If it doesn't go so well, then it could also be that actually insufficient supervision could undermine research integrity. And our group has also previously labeled this as a research misbehavior, because the norm should be to mentor your PhD candidates with at least sufficient attention. Now, there is not a consensus definition yet of what responsible supervision means, but often when you talk about it with authors and you also screen the literature, we find three basic components. The first being that the supervisor is a role model. So this means that the supervisor, him or her themselves, actually engages in responsible research practices. They consistently share their data and code. They publish open access. And the second being that, it could also be that the supervisor has more of a coordinating role maybe. They're not still in the lab every day, but then they can nevertheless encourage their PhD candidates to take the time and to become familiar with these new practices. For example, what would be the most adequate repository to share your data? Can you actually look this up and take the time to find an appropriate one for us? And finally, and I think this will hit close to home to a lot of PhD candidates who hopefully are listening, is the idea that a responsible supervisor is also able to create a psychologically safe climate. And with that I mean that the PhD candidates under the supervisor feel open and feel that they can share mistakes, that they can discuss dilemmas, that they can say, I don't know, and that they won't be punished for this sort of behavior. I'm very glad to see that research in the area of responsible supervision is growing. And here I'm picking from a review that was done by Pizzolato and colleagues of 24 empirical studies on the topics of responsible supervision, mentoring, research integrity. But there were also some gaps because the majority of those studies were surveys. Surveys often focus on perception, so they ask, what did you think about this? they often only engage with one party, so either the supervisors or the PhD candidates. And there is very little on that very important, or supposedly important, role modeling. And this is what I wanted to know more about. And in particular, if this role modeling is so important, then we thought that PhD candidates that would be mentored and supervised by a supervisor who consistently engaged in responsible research practice themselves should also more likely to display those in their PhD thesis. So this is what we tried to look at. And today I'll only be focusing on two practices, namely the publishing open access and sharing your data openly. If you want to see more, it's pre-registered and you can check out the link below. Now, our population then consisted of pairs of PhD candidates and their main supervisors, often a full professor in the Netherlands. They had to work in biomedicine, as Jeroen already alluded to. I work in a biomedical institution now myself as well in Berlin. And they had to also then be affiliated with the Dutch University Medical Center. We had quite some digging into what would be suitable repositories to yield this relevant metadata. After all, we had to find a reliable way of knowing this was the supervisor that supervised this particular PhD candidate. But we found 4, in Leiden, Amsterdam, Maastricht and Groningen. And then we have been extracting a lot of data from those repositories between April and June of this year. And this mainly regarded PhD theses that were defended either this year or in the very last months of the previous year, also because we wanted to keep it slightly comparable. And I had a little bit of a challenge when initially designing this study, because to the best of my knowledge, no people had done this before. So we did a small pilot study where we only included 30 pairs of PhD candidates and supervisors. And there we found a correlation of 0.2 for the practice of publishing open access. So based on that, we calculated that we needed 194 pairs of PhD candidates and supervisors. But we didn't always just want them, because there were a few eligibility criteria for us. So the publications by the PhD candidate, first of all, had to be part of their PhD thesis. Dorothy has already talked this morning that sometimes people even publish before they start a graduate degree. They also had to be empirical publications. It's a bit unfair to look for open data statements in a commentary, and we didn't want to do that. They also had to be published latest 2018, and this is a sort of proxy for us to know that that is a reasonable time that they were still supervised by the person in question. And they had to be the sole first author, because we were, of course, interested in the effects of their supervisors' behaviors. And it had to be at least 2 publications in their thesis that would fit these rough eligibility criteria. And then we extracted the DOIs from these relevant publications, and we also extracted, of course, the institute they were working at and the date that their thesis was defended in years. Very similar for the supervisor, albeit then supervisors, as you all know, are often, especially when they become a full professor, more likely to be last author. So we extracted sole, first, and last author publications by supervisors, and we wanted to have at least 3 publications by the supervisors. We managed to extract a total of 211 pairs, which led to a total of 2,062 DOIs. So 2,062 publications are in our data set. You may wonder, is that not a little bit higher than what you needed? And that's very true, but we might actually find that some don't meet our eligibility criteria when we're going to screen the full publication. So we deliberately oversampled. And as you can see, we had a fair composition from the 4 different university medical centers. Then I wanted to look at 2 practices, namely open access and open data. We determined open access using the unpaywall API. And this API sort of allows you to search, also using the unpaywall database, all possible versions of a paper that are out there. And then we applied a sort of hierarchy to know what's the best possible version of this paper in terms of openness. And we assessed open data using OddPub. OddPub is a text mining algorithm that is designed to extract data sharing statements from biomedical publications. We then classified them as follows. So for unpaywall, we say a publication is open if it's either published, if it's gold or green or hybrid, and closed when it's bronze or closed. I'm happy to go into detail about these categories later, but I presume the audience is aware of them. For unpaywall, for the data from OddPub, we did a much simpler distinction. At this stage, at least, if OPUB returned a data sharing statement for this publication, we said yes, and if it didn't, we said no. So first, a little bit of descriptives about our particular sample. So here you can see our prevalences. So for open access, you can see that at least the pairs that we had included from the Netherlands seem to be doing fairly well. A total of about 83% of publications in our sample was published open access, according to our criteria. And when it comes to sharing open data, we see about 9% of publications had data sharing statements with them. In terms of the correlations, we see a slightly bigger correlation between the supervisor publishing open access and the PhD candidate publishing open access. But overall, I would say that these two correlations are fairly similar. So for open data, that's 0.2. But then we wanted to take this a step further. And for this, we used logistic regression models. So first, we transformed our data set because we had 2,062 DOIs. We transformed it to the level of the PhD candidate. So PhD candidates in our sample had different publications, so they are clustered within the PhD candidate. And then we recoded all the publications and the behaviors by the supervisors into some categories. So for open access, we said, okay, from all of the publications we have from a particular supervisor in our data set, did any of them have open access? If no, we said never. If up to half of the publications by this supervisor that we had included were open access, we said sometimes. And if more than half of them were published open access, we said often. And for open data, we simply looked at, okay, from all of the publications we have by this supervisor in our data set, does any of them have data sharing statements? And if it did, we said yes, and if it did not, we said no. So here what I did is I'm already showing you the odds ratios. But the interesting thing is, so of course we'll focus on open access. So for open access, we're finding that a PhD candidate who has a supervisor that sometimes published open access had a 0.25 times higher odds to also publish open access compared to a PhD candidate who had a supervisor that never published open access. And fairly similarly for the second dummy, which measures or describes the difference between a supervisor who very often published open access versus a supervisor that never published open access. But personally, much more interesting is what I believe the effect for open data. So if your supervisor actually shared their data sort of recently in the years that you were working together, we see that the odds that you would also do that as a PhD candidate is about twice as high. And I personally think that's very encouraging, and it may also showcase that there's a potential for supervisors to really, take their role as a role model very seriously in this regard. Now, it may help to put these numbers a little bit into context first. So for open data, Sergiu and colleagues and this was a paper published in 2021, they used the same text mining algorithm as we did, but then they looked at the entire PubMed Central database. They found 8.9% of publications to return with an open data statement. So actually there, I think our sample is not very far off from what we're seeing internationally. When it comes to open access, and for both numbers, I've tried to look up the best possible data out there on biomedicine, because all of our publications were from biomedicine. It seems to be that all of the efforts when it comes to promoting open access in the Netherlands have worked. The most optimistic data that I could find earlier was somewhere above 30. And these authors looked at a lot of publications in the Web of Science, so they may have been missing some things, but I still think it's fair to say that if you were to compare the Netherlands to the sort of international space here, that some of the open access work also by funders in our space may have actually paid off in recent years. But then I also want to say something about the role of PhD candidates, because you may be wondering, am I not portraying PhD candidates too passively? And I really want to say that's not what I'm intended to do. Our design also doesn't allow for any of those sort of inferences, but I'm very well aware that there are actually many brilliant initiatives to promote reproducibility and open science that I really think are spearheaded by early career researchers. And I put two examples, the reproducibility reading groups and the open science communities here on the slide, because I know they're very, very crucial here in the Netherlands. But another thing we may want to think about is, it seems to me that a lot of the training and education initiatives when it comes to research integrity are actually focused on the level of the PhD candidate. So it may be that they have much more knowledge about what are good ways to publish open access, how can I best share my data. So of course there's also a question of who teaches who. And here I also put a reference to a recent commentary by Peter Lato and Diedericks, who actually argue that this might be the way forward for research integrity, but we need reverse mentoring. And I think all of that is true. But I also think that if young people come to work in a lab, they may bring in all this knowledge and all of these sort of ideas. But if they land in a space where the person they're supposed to look at most intellectually never engages in any of this, that can still be so undermining. And it may actually mean that it dies their enthusiasm, and it kills it way before it should have done that. And also that if you're already doing all of this and your supervisor is also actually sharing their data and you are sharing their data, maybe we even see an enforcing effect, who knows? But I think it's worth exploring that more. So let me close on a few next steps. We are still due, me and my brilliant team, to screen all of the data sharing statements, because OPPUB returns a statement, and that to novice eyes can look a little bit like gibberish. And we do need to go the extra mile of actually verifying whether the authors truly made their data openly available, or whether they wrote a very elegant prose, sneaky formulation that actually did not result in any open data. So this is something we're still doing as we speak. And we also want to look at the full text of all of these PDFs that we managed to include to look for other relevant research practices. So remember, this is a biomedical sample, but it would be very interested to see if there were methods that were made openly available, where studies registered, were they pre-registered, was there an open protocol? I would also be interested in the extent to which these publications acknowledge their limitations of their work, and maybe they also used appropriate reporting guidelines. So this is a little bit of a look into the future. And then I want to thank you for your attention and close with this thing that I've taken from the PhD comics, which I think is an important image for all the supervisors out there to remember. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Tamarinde. This was brilliant. Questions from our audience here? Anyone? Jelte.
Thanks, Tamarinde. The question bears on the things you discussed at the end. Do you have any data to show how many PhD students exceeded their supervisors in open science practices? Because that would, attest to that reverse mentoring, teaching the all to do the right thing.
That is an excellent suggestion, and I think we technically have that data. We have not yet looked into it, but I think it's worth adding it as an exploratory analysis to our pre-registration, so thank you.
That was quick. So there's a question from our online audience. Can you say anything about how to get the people involved who, for example, don't think supervision is that important, or think that they are already excellent supervisors, they've done it for decades, or think that when you need better or more supervision or mentoring, you're not really fit for a career in academia? How do you speak to those people? Is there anything you can share on that?
I actually would then like to slightly zoom out a little bit from talking about research integrity purely, and also enter parts of the mental health and burnout debates that we're seeing in the Netherlands. And I think in particular we have in recent years seen shocking data about the number of PhD candidates that are suffering from a burnout, and also, as Gowrie already alluded to, the number of PhD candidates that don't actually finish their degree. And very, very often the supervisor plays a role in this. And I think collectively there we're talking about a little bit less often discussed form of massive research waste, both in terms of money, in resources, in sometimes people that may be traumatized for life. So I actually think that these people should do a bit more of their research.
Fair enough. Maybe you can insert a quick plug to the Superb Supervision course that you've developed. Why don't you share with the audience here and online where they can find more information about that program?
We have recently published our pilot evaluation of that study in Accountability and Research. So if they were to Google Superb Supervision and my name, Tamarinde Haven, I think they should be able to find it. And as already alluded to, if you work at the University of Amsterdam or the Amsterdam University Medical Center, your institution may actually offer it for you, because at least there we're seeing some part of valuing this as proper training and professionalization of their staff.
Great. So Google is your friend here. Superb Supervision, Tamarinde Haven. A question from online, Claudia Lutke. How can you reach senior researchers in training? If it is obligatory, they might, dig their heels in and, resist. But if it's voluntary, it might be the case that those who need it the most won't show up, and those who don't need it are, entering your program. So is there anything we can do to get the right people in training?
I think it's a very difficult question, but I think Claudia also touches on a very relevant point that if we may simply say we make this compulsory for all, we might not really be able in our trainings also to create the type of atmosphere where people are really willing to learn and where people are also really willing to grow their soft skills and maybe be a little bit more vulnerable. So I think that part of the movement that's going on in the Netherlands with recognizing and rewarding might actually be of help here, because I really, really hope that professional supervision is going to be more recognized as a vital thing that people can be tremendously good at and be valued as a scientific contribution in its own right. And there are other ideas about if it may consistently not go well with someone's PhD candidates. Is there a way in which we might be able to intervene? And I don't want to say immediately publishing people, or punishing people, because I always think there are two sides to a story. But I do think it's more worth the investigating and also ask supervisors to learn from one another and perhaps to hold one another a little bit more accountable as well in our own departments. Because I think we have a little bit of a culture where you don't really criticize one another on these sort of behaviors. We're very fond of criticizing one another on every little flaw we can point out in someone's argument. But I would look forward to a future where we may also occasionally try to push one another to become better.
That sounds good. So incentives, sticks and carrots. I think a final question from our audience here.
Thank you, Tamarinde, for your talk. I'm Steven de Peuter from KU Leuven, University of Leuven. When hearing about supervision, I just wanted to add that at KU Leuven we have iSupervise, which is also training for professors. It's mandatory for newly appointed professors, so they all have to go through this two-day training where they get information about supervision, but also mentoring and so on. And now we are considering whether it should be mandatory for more senior professors who never had this training, but then again, it could be that they could be entrenched if you make it mandatory and so on. But it's mandatory for newly appointed professors, and it is evaluated very well. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'm very happy to hear more about it later.
Good, good. We're going to draw this part to a close, and I should say Tamarinde has to run off. And do you mind if I share with the audience why? Is that okay?
No, go ahead.
Okay. This is super exciting. Tamarinde is getting married tomorrow with Wout, who's also in the audience. So, a big applause and congratulations, because this is amazing. So have an absolutely wonderful day tomorrow, and you're forgiven from, for not being part of the panel later today. Have a great day.